Hello everyone, welcome back to the 10 days of JavaScript. Here we are in day number 7, and in this lesson we are going to talk about the difference between returning and mutating. Now don't worry, I do not expect you to know what I mean by those two words right now. And before we try to jump right into the concepts, let's first begin by just giving ourselves a bit of sample data to work with or experiment with. And I want you to type this out with me. So let's create a variable and name it pets. And I'm going to set it to equal an array, so square brackets. And I actually want each item in this array to be an object. So to create an object, we include curly brackets. Let's give this first object a property of name, and then colon, and then give it a value. I'm going to name this first pet Meows a Lot. Right after the quotes for that name value, I'm going to include a comma, and then give it another property of species, and give it a value of cat. And then finally, comma, one more property. I'm going to give it an age of 2. Okay, so we've got one object that represents a cat. Now I want to create additional objects within this array. But just for the sake of staying organized, I don't want this line of code to become super long and difficult to read. So what I'm going to do is right in between the beginning square bracket and curly bracket here, I can just drop down. And then right after the closing curly bracket for our object, I can drop down again. Okay, and now we can just add a comma at the end of this line, and we can include another pet object. So then we can have one per line. So it's easy to read. So let's create a dog this time. I'm going to give it a name of Barks a Lot. Species should be dog. And let's say age is 3. And while we're at it, let's create one more animal object. So name, I'm going to name this one Purrs Loud. Give it a species of cat. And I will say that it's 8 years old. Okay, now if you want to pause the video lesson right now to give yourself a minute to type this out, that's okay. And next, let's do a quick review. So 2 or 3 lessons ago, we learned that we can programmatically add on to the end of an array by using the method named push. So we could start with our variable, pets, and then in JavaScript, arrays have access to a method, so dot push. And then let's imagine that we want to add on a dog to the array. So curly brackets to create an object. Let's give it a name of Pupster. Let's give it a species of dog, and I'll give it an age of 1. Okay, now let's test this out. Let's log out the pets array to the console and see if the new dog was successfully added. And just to be clear, you want to open your console by right-clicking down in the preview area of CodePen, and then choose Inspect, and then click onto the console tab. Okay, so back in our code, we could say console.log, and then just log out our pets variable. So if I check the console, we see an array with 4 items. If I expand it, awesome. We see the final object is that new Pupster dog. Cool, now this is not new. We already learned about the push method several lessons ago. The reason I'm showing it again right now is because it's a great example of understanding the difference between mutating and returning. So in this context, the word mutating just means changing or modifying. What I mean by this is when we call the push method on this array, it's going to modify or change or mutate that original array, right? After this line of code runs, the pets array has changed. However, that's not all that the push method does. It also returns a value. It returns the number of items that are now in the array. So in this case, it would return a value of the number 4. However, we are not seeing that value of 4 because we didn't store this in a variable, nor did we log it out to the console, nor did we output it onto the web page. So right now, the value that this push method is returning is just sort of sitting in outer space, sort of in no man's land. Now, just as a test, we can see the value that it returns by maybe logging this entire line to the console. So check this out. I want you to cut this entire pets.push line into your clipboard. So I'm going to select this, cut it, and then let's write out console.log, and then in the parentheses, just paste in your clipboard. Okay, now if I check the console, there we see that value that the push method is returning. So it returns a simple number value, but the line of code also still ran and mutated the array, because when we logged out the array, we see that there are still 4 items, and the pupster object was successfully pushed onto the array. So we could almost say that the push method lives a double life. On the one hand, it performs an action on the array, right? It changes or mutates the array. And then on the other hand, it returns a value. Now, the real question here is, why is this interesting? Well, the reason this distinction between mutating and returning is important is because there are other array methods that do not mutate or change the array, and they only return a value. Now, up until this point, the array methods that we've seen, like push and splice, well, really the main reason you would use these methods is to mutate or change the array. And the values that these functions return almost seems like a weird side effect that would never be very useful. However, right now, I want to show you 2 array methods that are extremely useful, even though all they do is return a value, right? They do not mutate the original array. And those 2 methods that I want to show you are map and filter. So let's do this. I'm going to erase this console.log pets line at the very bottom. Okay, below this, on a new line of code, I want to show you the map method. But first, let's give ourselves a goal to work towards. So let's imagine that we want to create a new array of these same pets, except in the new array, instead of each animal being represented as an object with these different properties like name and species and age, maybe in this new array, we only want the name of each animal. So we would literally want an array that just said meows a lot, and then the next item was barks a lot, and then the next item was purrs loud and pupster. So how can we achieve this? Well, luckily, the map method is perfect when you want to create a new array that is based on another array. Let me show you what I mean. So down on this new line of code, let's begin with our pets array, and then say dot map. So in JavaScript, every array has access to a method named map, and map is a higher order function. It accepts a function as an argument. Now, before we pass a function into these parentheses here, let's talk a little bit about what map is actually going to do. So the map method does not mutate or change the array that you call it from. Instead, it simply returns a new value. And the value that it returns is a brand new separate array. Let's include a function within the parentheses here, and then I will explain how the map method really works. So I'm going to make up a function name. Let's call it name only. Okay, then on a new line, let's create a matching function with that new name. So function name only, parentheses, curly brackets. And now what the map method is going to do is call this function once for each item in the pets array. So it's going to loop through the array. In our case, our array has 4 items, so it's going to call this function 4 times. But if your array had 500 items, it would call the function 500 times. Now ultimately, the map method returns a brand new array. And how it works is each time it calls our function, whatever this function returns is what's going to get added on to the brand new array. Now don't worry, I do not expect this to make sense just yet. I think in about 60 seconds from now, it's going to start making sense. Just as a test, within the body of our function here, let's return a string of text that simply says hello. Now ultimately, on this line of code, the map method is going to return a brand new array that simply contains the word hello 4 times. But as of this moment, that array value that the map method is going to return is going to get returned into outer space or no man's land. So instead, why don't we save this into a new variable? So at the beginning of this pets.map line, let's say let, and you can make up any variable name. I'm going to call it our test. Let it equal whatever pets.map is going to return. Now, just as a test down here, let's log out to the console the our test variable. So we can say console.log our test. And if we check the console, we do indeed see an array with 4 items, and it's simply hello, 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 hello. This is where things might start to make sense for you. There are 4 items in the pets array, and because the function that we provided the map method simply always returns a value of hello, that's what gets added on to the brand new array that map is creating. Now let's get back to the goal at hand. Remember, we wanted to create a brand new array that was simply the name of each pet. So check this out. When map calls the function that we provided, it passes into the function the current item that it's looping through. So down in our function, inside the parentheses right after our function name, let's include a parameter. I'm just going to say x because it's easy to type, but you could call it pet or animal or item. The name of the parameter does not matter. The idea, though, is that the first time the map method calls our function, x, or this parameter, would represent the meowsalot object. And then the second time map calls our function, x would represent the barksalot object. So instead of returning the word hello, let's get rid of the quotes hello. And if x represents the current pet object that's being passed into our function, we know that you can look inside an object with the dot, and we are interested in the value of the name property. So we can just say x.name. And if we check the console, awesome. We see an array with 4 items, and it is simply the names of each animal. Now let's change gears. So we just saw the map method in a nutshell, and before we finally get to the fun part or the aha moment part of this lesson, I want to show you one more array method that is named filter. Let's give ourselves a quick goal. Let's imagine that we want to create a new array that only contains the dogs from the pets array. So no cats, only dogs. How can we achieve this? Well, luckily, in JavaScript, all arrays have access to a method named filter. So check this out. We can go ahead and get rid of this console.log our test line. And let's say pets.filter. Filter is very similar to the map method. So it does not mutate or change the array that we call it from. It simply returns a value that is a brand new array. And it's also a higher order function. So let's try this. At the beginning of this line, let's save this into a variable. So let's say let dogs equal whatever pets.filter is going to return. Now within these parentheses, let's pass filter a function. I'm going to make up a function name. Let's call it only dogs. Okay, and now let's actually create a function with that matching name. So function only dogs, parentheses, curly brackets. And just like with map, filter is going to call our function once for each item in the pets array. The difference is that with filter, our function doesn't specify exactly what should get added to the new array. Instead, we simply return either true or false. Let me explain what I mean by this. So within the parentheses for our onlyDogs function, let's include x as a parameter, right? And the first time that filter calls our function, x, the x parameter, is going to represent the first item in our array, which happens to be the meowsalot object. So down in our brand new function, if we return a value of true, that meowsalot object will be added to our brand new filtered array. If we return false, that item will be skipped and it will not be added to the new array. So, since we learned about true and false values in an earlier lesson, check this out. If we only want dogs, we can simply say x.species == dog. The double equal sign comparison operator is going to boil down to either true or false based on the values to its left and to its right. So in other words, this is only going to return true if the item is a dog. So let's test this out. Down here, let's log out to the console our dogs array. So we can say console.log dogs. If we check the console, we see an array with 2 items. If I expand it, awesome. It only contains Barks-a-lot and Pupster. Now really quick, I just want to do one more thing before we finally get to the aha moment of this lesson. Back in our code, right beneath our onlyDogs function, why don't we create a brand new function and call it onlyBabies. So function onlyBabies, parentheses, curly brackets. And we could use this function if you imagine that we only wanted an array of pets that were younger than the age of 3. So within the parentheses, let's include a parameter to work with the current item. And let's say only return true if x.age is less than 3. Okay, now this is finally the aha moment of the lesson. Down here, let's get rid of the console.log dogs line. And check this out. Let's imagine that we want to create a new array that is simply the names of the dogs that are under the age of 3. So we could create a variable and say let baby dog names equal, and then we could begin with our pets array and call the filter method and filter out for only dogs. And now this is the cool part. Because this highlighted section of code is going to return an array, well, we can just look inside that array that it's going to return and filter it again. Now, what we just did is super important in terms of understanding JavaScript. So you've already heard me say this about 100 times, but when I say that all arrays have access to these methods, I literally mean all arrays. Not only arrays that have been already saved into a variable, but even arrays that are just sort of floating in outer space or in no man's land. So as soon as this highlighted part returns its value or its array, that array is just sort of floating in memory or floating in outer space, but then we can tack onto it and say, hey, that's an array just like any other array. It must have access to these array methods. So another dot filter, and this time we can filter for only babies. And finally, if we want this array to only contain the name property and not the age or species, well, we know that this is going to return an array, so we can just look inside that array and call the map method. And remember, our old function was named nameOnly, and it also returns an array, and that is what we can finally let get saved into our variable. Let's go ahead and test things out by logging this to the console. So console.log baby dog names. And if we check the console, awesome. It's an array with just one item and it's only the name. The big takeaway point for this lesson is that even though these methods do not mutate or change the original array, they are still incredibly powerful. They are powerful on their own, but then once we realize that we can chain together multiple actions like this, we begin to see the true nature of JavaScript and how creative we can get with our code. Chaining together actions like this is not limited to only arrays. We can do this with basically any data type in JavaScript. If it's not crystal clear, do not worry, because this is a concept that we are going to practice again and again throughout the course. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we are going to learn about scope and context. So what in the world do those words mean in relation to JavaScript? Well, let's keep things rolling and let's find out in the next lesson. The 10 Days of JavaScript is the first chapter for my upcoming premium course, Full Stack JavaScript from Scratch. I'm making these first 10 or 11 videos freely available on YouTube, and so for the next 10 days, I'm going to upload one new video each day. So stay tuned, or if you're watching this in the future, all the lessons are up, so feel free to binge watch. The full premium course is not available just yet, but if you subscribe to this channel, you'll be notified as soon as it's out. Or if you're watching this video in the future, it's already available. Enjoy!